Thank you. Senator Perdue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. We have a vote coming up, and I would ask the panel to be brief. I just have a couple of questions. First of all, the U.S. is enabling a dictatorial regime in Venezuela, in my mind, as it continues to routinely violate human rights affairs there in Venezuela. I would argue primarily because we continue to rely on imports of oil produced in their state-run enterprises. It seems somewhat hypocritical to me to want to limit what others are doing in Venezuela while we're quite happy to continue to import $30 billion of oil each year. It's another reason why projects like Keystone continue to be critical to reduce our dependence on oil from bad actors like Venezuela. But I want to go to a separate issue, and that is Cuba. You know, last year, Venezuelan President Maduro referred to President Obama's shift in policy towards Cuba as, I quote, a gesture of courage, unquote. Will this opening of U.S. relations with Cuba hurt or help our situation in trying to change behavior with Maduro? And what impact will this change in Cuba policy have on our long-term effort here to bring democracy back to Venezuela?
Well, Senator, diplomacy is not a one-size-fits-all, and so we basically have to kind of see where the opportunities are, make our decisions on what will best advance our national interests. And we have decided, for example, that it advances our national interests to combine, with regard to Venezuela, sanctions and reaching out to other Latin American like-minded countries to urge the Venezuelan government to meet its democratic obligations. And so that is one strategy that we have used towards Venezuela.
I'm sorry. Let me get to the point. We're going to run out of time, and we're going to have to bolt. Specifically, if we move to a more liberal relationship with Cuba, what specific impact will that have on Maduro and his continuing dominance of his people in Venezuela?
I'm not sure that there will be a direct relationship.
Okay, thank you. The next is, you know, given the difficult situation in Venezuela, they have an oil economy, basically. And as I see it down there, the consumer is really not able to bring their economy back. But how is this going to help or hurt their financing program, PetroCaribe, or its extensive support to Cuba?
I think Venezuela's mounting economic problems are manifested itself in a whole variety of ways, but one of them clearly is an inability to sustain the support to PetroCaribe like it had in the past. We have seen reports of Venezuela cutting back its support through PetroCaribe, subsidized support through PetroCaribe, to a variety of Caribbean countries. And so that really puts into question the ability of Venezuela to maintain the level of support it had promised in the past.
So one last quick question. If we really wanted to change behavior in Venezuela, oil is the way to do it. I just don't believe these sanctions go far enough to really change behavior. We see it in other parts of the world, Russia particularly, when we started out with similar sanctions there, had no impact. Mr. Smith, what do you believe would be the impact if we really were to get serious about changing behavior in Venezuela to go after the oil? And that means that we'd have to pay a price too, because the oil that we bring in, the $30 billion, is done in JVs, I think, with U.S. corporations with their state-owned oil enterprise.
Answer?
Yes, please.
We have made, after consulting with a variety of civil society actors and political actors in Venezuela, we have made the decision that it really advances U.S. interests not to use sectoral sanctions in Venezuela.
What does that? I'm sorry.
To use like an oil sanction.
So specifically, we think that these sanctions will change the behavior of this despot in Venezuela.
We believe the sanctions that, under the authorities that we have as a result, help highlight unacceptable behavior.
And how long do you think it will take to change that behavior specifically?
I can't say.
Well, what's a reasonable person's estimate?
I really can't say.
Well, let me ask it a different way. So how long would we be patient to watch the human rights violations in Venezuela before we stiffen those sanctions?
We think that if Venezuela is going to stop this downward slide, it is basically through more democracy, and the best way to express that is through holding elections that are seen as credible. And we believe that the international community can play a role towards that. I think we need to combine the use of sanctions in order to against individuals, in order to express our democratic principles.
But we have,
need
I'm sorry to interrupt, but those sanctions against individuals, we have really very little evidence around the world that sanctions against individuals have ever really changed behavior. So I think it's more a question now. Let's see how long it's going to take. My question is what's a reasonable expectation on our part of these sanctions relative to changing behavior? It's one thing to have an election, as we just talked about, but to have a credible election, to give a free vote for the people down there. I mean, what should be a reasonable time frame while we wait for these to take effect?
I can't say, sir.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to wait for